In this week's Cardiology Countdown, we'll cover obstructive sleep apnea and its effect on AFib ablation recurrences. We'll also look at the outcomes in the Aristotle trial in permanent or persistent versus paroxysmal AFib, should they be anticoagulated with the new anticoagulants, and also a look at biventricular pacing amongst people with an indication for pacing and LV dysfunction. So to begin with, we'll look at a study that looked at patients undergoing AFib ablation and the risk of recurrence in patients with or without obstructive sleep apnea, and by whether they received treatment with CPAP. Now, interestingly, the CPAP treatment, as has been seen in other populations, was well correlated with improvement in AFib, and so fewer recurrences in those who had CPAP treatment. It was event-free AFib survival was 72% versus 36% amongst those who got CPAP therapy following AFib ablation. Overall survival without antiarrhythmics was also significantly improved. And as such, I think it is a reminder that a key part of overall prevention of AFib with ablation is treatment of other drivers of AFib. So next up is a sub-study from the Aristotle trial, and this looked at the new anticoagulant Apixaban as compared with warfarin in patients with non-valvular atrial fibrillation. Overall, the trial showed a reduction in stroke or systemic embolism, also in major bleeding and in mortality. And this analysis looked at the 15% of patients who had paroxysmal AFib. And so one would wonder, do you really need to anticoagulate those patients? And so what was seen is that these patients were at reasonable risk, slightly lower risk than those with persistent or permanent atrial fibrillation in terms of stroke risk or mortality. But a similar benefit of Apixaban was seen in both the paroxysmal as well as the persistent and permanent AFib, and so no interaction at all, meaning that regardless of the really duration or frequency of atrial fibrillation, the newer anticoagulants have benefits in terms of both efficacy and in this case safety as well. And finally, our number one pick this week is the BLOCK-HF trial. This is an interesting look at the role of biventricular pacing as compared with standard right ventricular pacing in a novel patient population, those with high-grade AV block with an indication for pacing and LV dysfunction. And so they hypothesized that biventricular pacing would improve the event-free survival from death or worsening of systolic volumes or need for hospitalization for heart failure. And overall, the study randomized 691 patients and did find a significant improvement with biventricular pacing with about a 30% reduction from 55.6 down to 45.8% in the primary endpoint. Interestingly, it was directionally consistent for death, heart failure, and the worsening of systolic function measured by systolic volume. And so a benefit, as has been seen in other populations, of the biventricular pacing. This study will have to be looked at by the guideline committee, but could become a new indication for biventricular pacing. So for Cardiology Countdown, I'm Chris Cannon.